lecture. The lecture is being co-hosted by the ASL program in the Department of Linguistics and Humanities Center. I want to share a few comments first. First of all, I'd like to thank the Wolf Humanities Center and the ASL program in the Department of Linguistics for the support to make this presentation possible, and try to thank the interpreters. I want to try to thank them ahead of time because I'm afraid I'm going to forget that, so thank you to the interpreting team. And now, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our guest speaker for the evening, Crom Saunders. He is an associate professor in the ASL department at Cromania College in Chicago, where he teaches a number of ASL linguistics, deaf studies, and interpreting courses. He began working at Cromania in the fall of 2009. He has a master's degree in creative writing from California State University, Sacramento. He also earned his BA in English from the California State University in Northridge. He is also a nationally certified deaf interpreter specializing in theater interpreting. Crom is actively developing a body of research based on ASL translation of the works of Shakespeare. And he is also collecting representations of deaf people in the media and how this ties in with the history and the current development of ASL and deaf culture. Recently, he published a chapter in the book, Online Identity, a different kind of imposter syndrome. The appropriation of American Sign Language and deaf culture, which was part of my impetus as to why I invited him to join us here tonight. So tonight's topic is the evolution in deaf identities. Please help me welcome Crom to the stage.
Okay, I've got a spot right here, and I gotta make sure I stay with it. Okay, good evening, everyone. So thrilled to be here. Jamie's introduction, she reached out to me because I published an article, and there were themes that had to do with this series. There were some keywords that came up, so it made sense. If you were to Google online and you pull up deaf identity, you'll see a whole bunch of content. But you know how the algorithm works. Typically, the most viewed tend to go out to the top of the screen, and it's not always an accurate portrayal. There are some bias, so we'll talk about that as we go along tonight. Again, my name is Crom, and this is my name sign. You can figure out why, right? With my eyebrows, I can tell. I am Crom, and I teach in Chicago. I teach many different courses. I worked in the interpreter training program for a while, but then I've helped run ASL, linguistics, translation. I teach a class of deaf representation in media, and right now I'm teaching in English department too. I'm teaching Shakespeare. So it doesn't have anything to do with ASL, but my research in Shakespeare is copious, and so I just love it. I really do. I'm working a lot with identity politics, sociolinguistics, which is really tied to identity, culture, and how it develops. And I feel like I have some things to offer to you this evening. We'll also have time at the end of my presentation for Q&A, so we'll open it up and have a nice dialogue. So that is the plan. Awesome. When I look at identity and culture, I want to make sure this is clear. I'm going to talk about cultural identity and then cultural evolution, not just the two separate. And that has changed a little bit over time. When we look at cultural identity, that's about understanding how you relate to a certain group, to your community. And you have shared experience. That's the most salient feature, right? And so that includes language, external influences, family connections, or not, shared ways of navigating the world around us, our values, our priorities are all part of that shared connection. And it doesn't just happen once, it evolves over time. And of course, we change over time. And so we see cultural evolution happen as well. Any culture, any community experiences change over time. Values, beliefs, priorities, and language will evolve over time. That is inevitable. That cannot be stopped. That always happens. So that's the definitions that I'm working with for this evening. All right? Yes? Not if you agree. All right. This is a picture. There was a painting by the artist Anne Silver. She's a well-known artist and part of the Devia movement. For those of you that aren't familiar with that term, Devia is Deaf Visual Image Art, is the acronym, Devia, and it has to do with portraying the deaf experience through art. Whether positive or negative, there can be celebratory pieces to celebrate our culture and language, and then also expressing discrimination and oppression. That's all part of the Devia movement, and Anne Silver was really a leader in that movement, and this is an artwork that she created back in 1999, so this picture is already 26 years old. That's one full generation ago already. It's a little bit blurry when we bring it up here on the big screen, but I want to be clear. The picture on the left is from 1899, the different identities, right? And if you look at the labels of the deaf community that they use for themselves, not that were imposed by others, you see them listed across, including dummy, lip reader, deaf and dumb, hearing impaired, handicapped, oralist, deaf mute, and lastly, freak. You might think, really, do deaf people call themselves that? Well, not necessarily. Hey, I'm a freak. That's a little bit more moderate right now, but the point being, okay. Just to back up, how people refer to themselves. They might have recognized that that's their place in society, and the word freak, how we interpret it today, is much different than the connotation in the past. It just meant that not going by what is normal, or what the norms, but it's the template that society had for norms, being able-bodied, not being disabled in any way. And so if you don't fit in with the norm, you were labeled a freak. And a good example of that was Helen Keller. You're sure, everybody knows who Helen Keller was, right? Her reputation, she learned how to speak and to sign. And she would tour with P.T. Barnum in the show as a freak because she was so different. She was an oddity, not because it had anything disparaging about herself. It's just, at that time, people were blown away that a deaf person could learn to speak like she did. And then we have these other labels that portray the deaf experience. And 100 years later, we have a different set of crayons, of different deaf identity. We have coda, seeing, deafblind, late deafened, deaf American, hard of hearing, signer, and deaf. And so obviously there are some distinctions there, but I want to share something. You know, this is 26 years later after this 1999 box of crayons, and today there would be different labels as well because change happens on an arc, and it happens exponentially. Things happen quickly. And that's something for me, who works in the field of designing curriculum and content around identity and culture. I'm always trying to keep up and update my curriculum to make sure that I'm including the latest information. And that has a lot to do with the internet. It's a big factor. And also, how each new generation shares their experience and talks about the cultural identity journey. That has really changed over time. All right, you with me so far? All right. would Anne Silverwood create if she was working together? Language is often rooted in social norms and social connections, social experiences. That's where language emerges from, to express how you feel, what you understand, or want to understand. And so the two terms now are very offensive to deaf people. You would not call deaf people this by any means, but in the past, deaf people use this on an everyday basis because at one point in our history, hearing people would use them, and deaf people themselves really believed that they could not vocalize. They thought that it was a physical, biological limitation, and now we know better. But for the longest time, that was the leading way of thought. And so deaf mute and then deaf and dumb were not offensive to deaf people. They would identify that and say, oh, of course I can't vocalize, I can't learn to speak. And then attitudes changed. You had numerous individuals that were innovators who said, you know what, I'm gonna try. And not just here in the United States, but all over the world. Italy, Germany, England started to have people who would teach people, deaf people, how to speak, how to use spoken language. And that showed that it can be done. And then those terms became very outdated. But not just that, deaf people unpack things and say, even if I don't want to speak, even if I don't want to learn how to talk, that implicitly says that I can't express myself in any way, that I don't have language, including sign language. Mutes cannot express themselves, they thought, using sign language, but that is outdated. For a while, please advance the slide, this was a book that was published in 1930. The author wrote this autobiography, Albert Ballin, and he called himself a deaf mute and talked about his experience and his journey through life. And he referred to himself in that way. He didn't think it was offensive, he identified that way, but then that term started to become, how do I put it? It was uneasy for some people. And then ASL hit a renaissance because it really came in time with the oralist revolution. We have the 1880s, right? And prior to that, deaf schools around the country had already been established. There were quite a few at the time, and they used a signing model of instruction. They were teachers of the deaf who used ASL, all the students signed, and then in 1880, we had the Milan Conference. And at that point, it really impacted deaf education and the model that was used. After that, they shifted to oral policies and curriculum. Those became priorities to teach deaf children how to speak. And many schools followed that model, and ASL was forbidden to use in the classroom, it was forbidden to use on campus whatsoever, on the premises. And in some situations, there have been some anecdotes that we've heard that people say, I couldn't even sign in the town where the school was located. We were forbidden without exemption. And so ASL at that point went underground. It didn't disappear, it just went underground. It was less visible, but it maintained. And then, over time, in the 50s and 60s, ASL started to peak again because many programs that followed oralism were struggling. They were not completely effective. Some people could learn to speak a little bit, but many others could not. And they noticed back then that ASL was very prevalent, right? And so they said, all right, let's try ASL again. And that was a paradigm shift. And with that paradigm shift, what happened was culture identities shifted as well. And ASL became in vogue again. We had our right to communicate using our natural language and felt very good about it. And so deaf mute just didn't apply to us any longer, even though for all this time, we've been talking for 50 years using spoken language.
Now, with that in mind, let's move on. As ASL became more lexically recognized in a variety of ways, on a sensing level, as well as the rights throughout the decades leading up to and including the 80s, we started to see some real growth in the deaf community, the deaf collective in the United States, really putting down roots. We were here to stay along with our language. Oralism, of course, and their programs didn't disappear, they continue today, and there continues to be some tension, some contention about how do I identify different people, what does it mean to be deaf, what is right and what is wrong, and a lot of conversations have been stirred up around these multiple identities over the past 70 years, several years through the 80s. So that's going to lead us to our next slide. Let's back up for just a moment and take a look at where we first see these terms and the views of these terms inside the community and outside the community, how they emerge, what factors they belong to. So of course, one is propaganda, clearly. So this approach, when we approach language, they will say, well, this language is better because of this and because of that. This other language is not so good and not so effective. This is the language we support, propaganda. That's one reason, something that we see still in use today, use of propaganda. Many organizations will organize around the use of sign language. Let me just step out for a moment and from my personal perspective about, I'm not against either language. I'm not against using spoken language, which I often use. I do, however, feel strongly that there needs to be access for whatever language works better for that individual, not a decision to be made from someone outside. It is a slippery slope when that starts to happen. So using speech has been successful for me. That does not mean that I would look down on anyone who makes a different choice about what language is right for them, right? They make that decision for them, I make that decision for myself. However, I am offended when I do see propaganda, if you will, about people who talk about the way to be effective communicators in the world, specifically using spoken language. And I have noticed that even though I personally do support sign language, I look at technology today. I see people who are using their spoken language and they have a lot of success in that area, which I didn't have access to those facilities many years ago. As a deaf person, there is no one way to be deaf. And we need to not promote that way of thought anymore. But for a long time, we did have that way of thought. That there was one way to be culturally deaf, and that was to be capitally deaf. Anything else didn't apply. But I've had to step back on a personal level and look at that broader, and I'm still looking at that today. I will come back to that concept, but now let me put my teacher's hat back on for you. Now, of course, let's look at science, how science approaches problems and looks deeper at it. So if you think about the idea first, they want to look and see, why did that happen? That's always the question, why? Why did this happen? What was the cause? But nobody studies it over the years. So we, for example, we look at our relationship to the sun, and nobody says, hey, which goes around what? What revolves around which, right? Of course, now we know better because we have science and we have people who have studied the Earth, and we understand that it's in fact the Earth that revolves around the sun. But when we have a problem that isn't studied, how do people, when they talk about how can deaf people speak, they assume that they cannot without studies. And until we have science behind it, we don't really know the authentic answers. Nobody's thinking deeper than that. They think, well, speech benefits people, but only people who use speech? Is that a scientific fact? Is there science behind this fact, or is there propaganda influencing this fact about how to communicate in the best way? Having that scientific foundation or not really impacts people's belief in the greater communities. They look to science and those pronouncements, and really those continue until they are validated to be more than just opinion. I can give you an example. Oralism, of course, has been around since the 1800s in the United States, and it has been has a strong foundation. But in the 50s, and I can't remember the exact year, but somewhere in the 50s, there was a science movie that came out. It was called The Tingler. The Tingler. It sounds a little dirty, but I promise you it's not. So it was science fiction, a science fiction movie. Okay, it was a different kind of movie, not what you're thinking. But so this science fiction movie came out. It was about aliens. And the aliens would attach themselves to your spine, and they would shock you to death. They would tingle you, I guess. They would tingle you to death. They would attach themselves to your spine, and the only way you could kill it was to scream, and it would fall off and die. So that was the movie, right? That was the essence of the movie. You might be thinking, what? But no, it did pretty well at the box office. It really did. It was starring Vincent Price who was quite the movie star at the time. I'm sure you're very familiar with Vincent Price. So in this story, here's Vincent Price, and he's playing the role of a doctor, a scientist, and he is the one who figures out how to beat the alien that you have to screen. But he has a maid who works for him who is deaf, and assuming the deaf mute in that movie, remember, it was the 50s. So the maid died because the maid attached to the maid's spine, and the poor deaf mute wasn't physically able to scream, and therefore was doomed and died. So whoever wrote that script clearly did not do their homework, because clearly, at that moment in history, what was that, in 80 years? Clearly we knew that deaf people could speak. And not just speak, but deaf people were perfectly able to scream. Deaf people knew how to scream because that's how we communicated with each other. They looked a lot like that. So, please. So we have facts, science, and cultural facts and knowledge, and sometimes they do not mesh because science hadn't caught up. When we look at our cultural norms, we know what is true. We know what is difficult from our own lived experiences. Okay. And then number 4 is priorities. When it comes to speech for deaf people, historically, most of the time, the priority is not coming from the deaf person themselves. It's coming from the hearing world who is determining what is best for that deaf person, because they should fit in and they should do what the majority does, but it is easier for hearing people if deaf people will use speech. And we've been seeing this throughout, millennial with deaf history, is that the burden of communication traditionally falls on the deaf person. You gotta learn to be like us. We're not gonna learn to communicate with you. So, even with this broad awareness and the population of ASL in the culture, it's very, very popular. More people are using ASL these days. It's so visible. You see it in the media everywhere you look. It's hard to see when people are signing. People at least know what it is, even if they don't understand what you're saying. So even with the visibility of ASL in our world today, sign language is still often referred to as not a real language. It's not real communication. You can't fully express yourself. No one could succeed using that as their primary language. The priority is that you should not use sign language, because I won't understand you, and we've been hearing that forever. There have been papers published over the years in any kind of form, using spoken language, of course, that deaf people should learn to speak, they'll do better. So the priorities is down to how deaf people should communicate, and we have learned to communicate in many, many ways. We've become experts in navigating the world with communication. We have rich, rich experiences in our life, whether we're using sign language, written communication, gesture, whatever works, or spoken language. I really do enjoy, well, let me rephrase. I appreciate how things have changed, because I remember when I was younger and I would tell people I was deaf, and then everybody would just shut down and not know how to proceed. And over time, they might gesture about writing back and forth or attempt to communicate, but now we have technology and things have changed. I will walk in and someone will ask me if I want to write back and forth, but nobody has paper anymore, right? Everything's digital. Nobody has paper. So I guess that's nice, we've got our phones in our back pockets and we can use those to communicate. But again, deaf people have rich experience in navigating communication in the world. It's never been a problem for us. It's never been a lack of priorities for us as a community. We have always been asked by the community, by that majority culture. They are asking us from their outside perspective what they understand what our priorities should be. But that does not come from within our community. And again, there are a lot of deaf people out there who are perfectly capable of using their hearing, using their voice, using cochlear implants or other amplification, and they do very, very well. And so the community continues to include and support all of those deaf peoples. But there's still an old school of thought that says, if you really subscribe to deaf culture, really it can be quite exclusive of people who use those other mediums. Deaf people who did not grow up signing often find themselves quite frustrated and unable to fit into the deaf community. They can't find themselves there because they are excluded. They don't pass the test, if you will, right? They don't pass the first few benchmarks to be allowed into our deaf world, and that is not going to help our community. That gatekeeping is not helpful to us in any way. I'm going to come back to gatekeeping in just a moment. Now, during the 70s, when ASL was officially recognized as a language, that it has a dictionary of ASL terms, and the world began to publish in linguistics articles about the effectiveness of the language, the efficiency of the language in linguistics programs studying specifically ASL through the 70s. And people began to change their labeling around that. They started to say, we're not deaf or disabled. They wanted to eschew those terms and call themselves a linguistic minority now, that it was the primary users of the language in school or in business or in government. It wasn't the language being used. We do have language, but we are a linguistic minority, the new term. So you're going to see two terms that the deaf community has no longer embraced. One is hearing impaired, and the other term is disabled. People will say now, there's nothing wrong with me. Physically, I'm fine. I'm not disabled, even though, right, the hearing is part of the physical body, but they viewed it as a physical barrier in the world, not themselves. They say that I can do anything I can do anything that I want. It's simply a linguistic barrier, right? I can do anything but hear. We've heard that. It's the language barrier. If there is language access presence, if there is equality, then what's the difference? That there is no disability. So they eschewed the term disability and its label. Hearing impaired as well. They would say, who would decide for us? Hearing people are referring to us as something less than, not the same, or lower than, simply because I can't hear. They also did not accept that term. We now use the term autism. That has come into vogue as well in the current day. When it comes to disability, this is very interesting. Disability community is vast. It's out there. It doesn't only include people who identify as deaf. People are often fighting for their rights. Specifically, we look to the 70s and the very famous slogan that emerged in the 1970s, nothing about us without us. That came out of the disabilities community's needs to be represented, to be at the table, because often they were dismissed, and that included deaf people as well. So we look at the deaf community and then the broader disability community and their relationship over time. People in the disability community welcomed the deaf community. The deaf community, however, did not accept that welcome. There are some individuals who did understand that rights were rights regardless, but all disabilities as defined by law and protected by law, deaf people would benefit from those laws as well under the disability umbrella. Even those laws, like IDEA, these laws, how should I say this? There are some broad strokes in those laws that don't really align themselves specifically to the needs of deaf people and their language access, but without the IDEA, without that law, the opportunities for advocacy and for opportunity would be greatly diminished, for access. Trying to find themselves and how they fit into the disability law. Often it doesn't fit every community perfectly because it is broad in its structure and its foundation, but before, deaf people did not embrace the term disability, but because of the advantage of the law, they have found their ways to align. And that's where we find ourselves now, and that's how I grew up, with that perspective. Deaf culture meant not accepting the term disability. At ASL, was our primary language. And those two facets were the biggest way to identify yourself, to be identifiers, was your identity growing up in the deaf community. And that created dichotomy of capital D deaf, culturally deaf people, and lower D deaf, that medical perspective, that physical perspective of hearing loss, that dichotomy emerged. Separating those who identify deafness as a culture with its language, its norms and traditions, and those who do not. But today, we recognize that within that dichotomy, it no longer applies anymore, because there is no one way to be culturally deaf anymore. There are many ways to be culturally deaf. That has become an old perspective, an old and creaky perspective. So we need to take a look at the identity shift again, that paradigm shift that's happening right in front of us in real time. We can't physically see it because it doesn't change overnight, but it is changing and it is happening, even if impacting my own personal curriculum and the colleagues that I am working with. And my students, just from 10 years ago compared to now, are completely different.
As compared to 20, 30 years ago. Just 5 years ago, we see the difference. My deaf cultural history class, I had to rewrite the curriculum already because it needed to be updated. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's great, because all humans are capable of knowledge, right? That doesn't exclude anyone, including us as deaf people. One thing that's interesting is hearing impaired is still not appropriate. It is not couched in the deaf community perspective. It's a very hearing stance, but disabled, and we'll go back to that just in a minute. At the same time, there is a parallel in our cultural evolution, because technology is really moving very quickly. Deaf people have been around for thousands of years, and in the last 10 years only, technology has really changed what the deaf person's experience can be. Hearing aids appeared in the 1970s and onward. LD communication was possible in the 70s. And now we can use our devices just like everyone else. But we used to have our own devices that we used over the phone. Phone like this, right, with a coupler. And we had access to that from the 80s on, which meant our way of socializing, our way to communicate, our way to understand what it means to be deaf. What it means to be deaf has changed over time. We're already seeing that, because in the past, the deaf world and hearing world didn't mix very much, and now there's so much synergy that's happening. Shared experience, we're seeing that, and a lot of it has to do with technology. The listening technology, the cochlear implants that I see functioning, or I saw in the 1980s and the 1990s, as compared to today, are worlds apart. You know, driving the 1920s with a Ford is very different than driving around today. I don't know what cars you like, maybe a Toyota. I mean, it's completely different, right? And the same thing applies to this. I mean, it worked, but barely, as compared to today's wonderful technology. The car will drive for you. You don't even need to be awake anymore, right? And so, from the 90s to today, cochlear implants have completely changed. In the past, I don't know if they were effective, maybe in a limited fashion, but today, I mean, wow. And the same thing with hearing aids. In the past, they would amplify sound, but now, with the digital programming and mapping, I mean, I live in Chicago, which means my hearing aid, and I'm not kidding, my hearing aids are digitally programmed to filter out all the wind. So that I can stand outside in a gust of wind and I can still pick up sound more clearly. Which means I have an advantage over hearing people. And they're hearing all that wind and I don't. That's deaf game, right? Yeah. And this is just one kind of technology, listening technology. When we look at the internet, my goodness, that has really become so entrenched in our lives. The internet helps us with research, we get information, we learn, we communicate, we can express ourselves. The internet is for building those connections. And it's just the way of life now, and deaf people definitely have used it and embraced it. And it was developed for hearing people, or people in general, but it has been very useful for deaf people. And on my own, I would have to develop things, and now I can just share what other people have already created, which is wonderful, because we're getting closer to the concept of technology as universal design, which benefits everyone. And I could go off on a tangent, but I won't, because I'm talking about identity here tonight. But I could really go off on a tangent and talk about universal design for a whole talk. Also, we have all of this range of deaf people. It's really a spectrum of deafness at this point, and deaf identity and deaf experience. It runs the gamut. Some people are profoundly deaf, multi-generational, using sign language since day one, as a baby with their parents. And maybe they want to use technology or not, but they sign fluently. And their experience going to a school for the deaf, being in the deaf community, being a part of the deaf family, and being immersed in the culture. That's one type, or if one person is their only person in their only deaf person in their hearing family, nobody else signs, they could function and choose to stay in that environment and go on that path for their whole life, but they're still deaf. And I would have to consider them as part of the deaf community as well. And that's important because in the past, they were excluded and it was us and them, right? No more. Deaf is deaf. And again, back to the gatekeeping and that dichotomy. You see this picture here, this two-headed monster. It's not natural. It's something that doesn't happen naturally. That gatekeeping in our community, unfortunately, still happens today. But it has changed. And I can tell you that for the longest time, I'll just talk about my own experience, culturally deaf meant that you use sign language and you identify with those priorities, but it was not inclusive of many people. Those that used implantations, those that used hearing aids, it's rather new. I mean, those people aren't going anywhere. And deafblind people as well. Their accommodation needs are different than just deaf people's needs, to the point where they have to develop their own language, protactile sign language. That is not ASL, that's a different language, because their experiences have been very different and separate, but they're still deaf. And people who don't check all the boxes according to their hearing level, their audiogram numbers, say that they're hard of hearing or a little bit deaf, or when you get older, you'll be late deaf and you have your hearing now, or you're not deaf, but your parents and siblings are deaf. They shouldn't be excluded. They're part of the deaf community too. They might not share the exact same experience as being frustrated with communication, but they've still been a part of it and they still resonate and can understand and empathize and have the same values and shared experience. Right? That spectrum is vast. And that dichotomy, that big D deaf has been around for too long and so limited. And that's not right. And now I'm not saying that it's been bad. I mean, it was a necessary part of our existence for the longest time. It was important for our evolution as the deaf community. It was important for our cultural identity to create a sense of belonging and connection through language, which was ASL, connection through having that shared experience, whether it was a mainstream setting or at a school for the deaf. Regardless, that was a necessity, but now that experience is much more broad. Things have changed. And that gatekeeper, making ASL a necessary benchmark for deaf culture, I disagree. Because I've met coaches from deaf families who don't sign because their deaf parents who decided not to sign with their children. So they're from a family that signs, but they don't. That doesn't mean that they are ignoring the deaf experience. They saw it, they're a part of it. And deaf people who have grown up oral and then later make that shift into the deaf signing community, but don't necessarily have that background growing up. Should we exclude them? Oh, they're not the same. They're somehow less than. No, they're valid as deaf people as well. And that gatekeeping is so commonplace that it comes up as an issue in the documentary series. I don't know if you've seen it, called Deaf You, right? That term, deaf elite, to give into a group of deaf people who had all those privileges. Oh my goodness, that word elite is very exclusionary. It's not inclusive at all. I mean, yeah, they've had a different experience, but that doesn't mean they can't benefit from others, and vice versa. Those interactions, that idea of not being on equal footing doesn't benefit everyone, and it comes from that imaginary dichotomy. And the funny thing is, when I say work, I mean, look, I love what I do. I absolutely do. I wouldn't call it work. I really enjoy it. But I guess it is my job, or jobs. I do have several career paths that I navigate at the same time. I'm an instructor, and I also present like here, and I perform, I interpret in theater. I work as a director of ASL at DAZZLE. So I'm the director of artistic sign language. I work with ASL performers and interpreters to give feedback on how they use the language. And also, I have independent research as it pertains to Shakespearean translation. I enjoy all of those things, which means I travel a lot. And I've met so many different people and had conversations afterwards. I'll be here for a while. If you want to talk, come by and say hi. But 3 questions come up again and again. Firstly, when did you graduate from Gallaudet? No, I didn't go to Gallaudet University. She already shared where I graduated. Both of those schools are in California. Secondly, do you have a deaf family? No, I was the only deaf person in my family growing up. In my whole family. Oh, okay. So you must have gone to a deaf school. No, I was mainstreamed. I have never been in a deaf program in my life. People say, wait a second. How do you sign so fluently then? What's going on here? But that question right there, how do you sign so fluently, that's gatekeeping. That's the idea that there are only 3 ways to be a fluent signer. No, I studied the language and I learned it. Just like many people who are not deaf learn ASL and can become fluent. Which means I have a kind of, there's a determination that you have to follow a prescribed path to get to this level of fluency, and therefore, deafhood. That's biased. And that bias has no place in today's world, to be honest. In today's world, we have opportunities to connect more than ever. Social media and the internet are a big part of that, which means you see one way to be culturally valid? No. And so I've seen this gatekeeping change. It's been around for a while, but it is changing. It is broadening. People are becoming more progressive. Also, there are limitations to identifying as a linguistic minority, that there's just a language barrier. This is a priority on differences in communication, but for many of us, understanding our access is not just based on communication. We need many other accommodations as well to live an equitable life. One prime example, I have 2 small children. If my wife is away, how do I sleep through the night and not know if they're waking up, if they're screaming? I need to know these things. And fortunately, I have the technology in place that'll help me. We have this baby signal that'll vibrate, and I can tell that they're up. Most of the time it's just a cat, but now I know. Right? Which means my access and accommodations is more than just language-based. And I love the fact that I actually have less needs to talk to people in person to work out the planning. I can do it all online. And it takes care of everything. I can do my itinerary all online. I don't have to go to the airport in person and write back and forth and give them my ticket. Little things like that have changed. The internet has been the great equalizer to a certain extent. And it's not just about communication needs. It's about accommodations. Accommodations for all deaf people are not the same. And if you look at accommodations for deaf people, a lot of those benefit other communities as well. How many of you use subtitles and prefer them to watch your shows? How many of you are deaf? Show hands. There you go. There's so many things that we benefit from that are not just for the minority, it's for everyone. And so ASL is the way that we can be successful. I mean, it helps, it works for many of us, but to focus on that as the only pillar of deaf identity and the only cultural experience, many deaf people are fluent, they like using sign language, they might marry somebody that uses the same language fluently, but then at work, they just have an interpreter and write back and forth, so they're not using ASL all day long, or vice versa. They sign it, they sign at work, but then at home, their spouse and children are not deaf, they use spoken language. It's not just about language, that's problematic. And right now, English is the language of the United States. Well, we'll see what happens with that. For ASL rights, for access, maybe we need to rethink that. And rethink how we can address access through communication. If it's just about language, there are going to be barriers that come up anyway.
Let's go to the next slide. So here we see a big paradigm shift, something that I struggled with for quite a while, until I came to understand its necessity. And more younger people really do identify and say, yes, I have a disability, I am disabled. I really did not embrace that. I saw myself as capital D deaf, and I had to understand the fact that I am also a disabled person. And that was based on the definition that was provided from people's individual experiences. And from deaf people in particular. A deaf person would call themselves that. They'd say, I am disabled. The first time I heard that, I was shocked, because this was from a multi-generational deaf family who had many generations of deafness, would identify as a person with a disability. That really surprised me. When I grew up, I did not hear those things. I was the only person in a mainstream setting. This person had a very different deaf experience growing up. It really hit me, and I wondered why. And that led me to reach further into community to get a broader sense of the feeling around this term. That disability does apply broadly and much more openly today as an identity through the lens of a disabled person. Huge shift that we're seeing right now. And again, this change is not happening overnight, but it is becoming more evident than it was even just a few years ago. And every single day, we're seeing more and more evidence of the same. So to the point where I'm feeling like people who are deaf, who do not agree that they have a disability, are standing out more than the reverse. Next slide. Younger deaf people will say they have a disability, not so much on a personal level, but they are disabled, in fact, by society. That the barriers that they experience come from society, the way that it was designed, the attitudes and perspectives, that is what creates the barrier, but is not inclusive. And therefore, a person who says that they have a disability, they might say, I'm not impacted by this disability until I try to engage with the larger world, and then I experience the barrier and the frustration of the disability. I have a colleague who is hearing and works in the ADA Service Center in Chicago. This person is blind and has been blind all of their life. They have navigated the world very effectively, and I love in the wintertime because I see them working their cane and they are completely wrapped up in the freezing cold, and I'm always just trying to figure out how they can navigate dressed up like that, because people are always like, how can they see where they're going wrapped up like they are, but they can navigate easier than others can. But every once in a while, something isn't up to code as they're navigating with their cane. And so there's a street sign, for example, a pole, that is supposed to be at a certain height according to code. And there are metal connections that connect the sign to the pole, but it will slide down on the pole. So a person could hit themselves in the head in that moment if they become disabled. When they're walking on the street, typically they would not feel disabled until they hit their head on that sign, in which time the environment disabled them and they are impacted by that disability. Now, it's something that nobody else might notice. I might say, hey, that sign's too low, I'll walk around it, but we don't see it from my colleague's point of view. young people today, especially deaf young people, will say, yes, I have a disability, but it's society that makes this disability happen. So when we're talking about a physical disability, they'll say, I don't see it that way, I see it as a cultural disability. Cultural disability, that's the identity that they embrace. Interesting, right? Now, I am not here to tell you, you have to call yourself disabled when you walk out of this room. That's up to you, but we have to accept that it is part of our greater community, and we have to acknowledge it. We have access and we have accommodations, so that we have to have those things in order to have a seat at the table. That's why they're important. And in my job, I work in a bubble, I work in a college setting, and I work in an environment where everybody signs. Student signs, faculty, everyone around me can use sign language. And if not, we have a sign language interpreter, they're ready to go. I teach several classes to students who are hearing and do not sign. Maybe intro to deaf culture, for example, deaf representation in the media, arts and humanities courses are open to anyone. They don't only have to be offered to ASL majors. So today, for example, I'm teaching Shakespeare in a completely different department. And I just have sign language interpreters in the classroom, and the class runs as a typical class would run. I'm a teacher, I have students, we run the class. The disability is removed because of the presence of the interpreters, the presence of the accommodation. Because of that, the college understands my need to be accommodated to provide me access to remove the disability. I never go to work thinking, let me see if I run into any problems today. Now that doesn't mean everything's always perfect. A couple of weeks ago, I was having an online meeting. There was some kind of, I don't know, committee meeting or something, whatever. So I show up to the online meeting, and there's no interpreter on the screen. I asked about the interpreter, and they completely forgot. That happens, so I didn't have to stay. Hey, I got a 3-hour back, let's go get some coffee. But that was disappointing. That does happen, and I become disabled in that moment because I can't participate. And honestly, listen, these meetings are boring. I was just happy to turn my screen off and do other work, but the point is that I didn't have the choice. I couldn't make that decision. I was not able to participate. So in my bubble, it's a strong bubble in my bubble, but the bubble doesn't hold at 1% still. I still have to recognize that at times I become disabled because anyone can become disabled because of the greater surrounding community and the perspective of outsiders in that community. So it doesn't mean that I walk around as a pessimist. I'm used to navigating the world. I know that everything isn't perfect for people with disabilities, but now I've started to really recognize that it's not the person, it's the situation that disables the person. And we need advocacy and awareness. This is critical for all of us. And that's something I really want to talk about in terms of social media. Advocacy and awareness in social media has exploded. I have so much respect for these people, these younger generation people who spend their days and nights uploading content, really important content, even just a joke, really demonstrates and shares their identity and experiences to such a broad audience. Next slide. Also interesting, one way that I feel that deaf people exist along this continuum, they are such important contributors to social media, very important with their identities as being deaf. Now I know you've seen there's a lot of deaf content creators out there on social media, and they have privilege because they are able to speak for themselves. We recognize that because the internet speaks to a large audience, and they do have privilege because they have access to that. I can't do that. I can't use my voice to speak. Well, not clear enough that anyone be able to watch, engage, and understand what I'm sharing. I have to use voiceover or captioning or some other accommodation, but there are some who can use their voice and really speak out, use it well, and it's great. They reach a large audience. They can get their message through to an audience who can understand their spoken language. Whereas if I try to do so, they might not be as receptive or not be able to engage, but there is no barrier for these content creators. It also means that they're able to reach people like them with like experiences who grew up using spoken language or other amplifications, and they're able to find their peers in the deaf community on social media. It's critical. A lot of people follow social media, look up to those creators, those younger people. These are Gen Xers. I'm Gen Xers, and we don't care so much about social media, not so much. Like, we're playing games on our phones, really. We're not really so much into social media. Social media is exhausting for me, but at the same time, I understand its value. I do. I like to share my own content from time to time, but that level of advocacy and awareness is not something I share. That's not my experience. Their role is important to us. This new identity, this new cultural awareness, this evolution in this place in time, in society, more than ever in our current day, in the state of the United States and the change that we're seeing out there in many, many ways. Advocacy and awareness is a critical part. It's very important because whether or not people use sign language, they have access to this platform. If somebody signs and speaks, then that's what it takes. Okay. Let me ask you, do any of you follow any social media content creators? Any that are deaf? A good number out there. I recommend that you follow more of them. They come up, they are just so amazing because they're more than just understanding deaf people and the diversity within the community. It's their experience as a younger generation that I didn't have. It's a completely different world with the technology that's ingrained in their day-to-day life. The way that they communicate is completely different than how I grew up. Okay, I grew up with a telephone, right? I had to rely on text-only communication digitally because there was no video phone when I was growing up. So I grew up in a completely different lens, a completely different world, and the generation before me had their own completely different experience. So I'm so interested in the world that they share with us. It's very, very important and allows me to make sure that my curriculum is aligned in terms of their modern life experience because it's not my personal lived experience. I get that from the experience that they share on social media. And not only that, but deaf people in general, they do not identify as just a person who is deaf or has a disability. We can go to the next slide. We have deaf people who also identify in many different ways as well. It is layered, multi-layered, cultural experiences and cultural identities. It is intersectionality. Now understand that term, it's a loaded term in the world. Intersectionality tends to include a host of things, and I understand and recognize that originally it came from the Black experience, so when I use that term, I borrow that term, and I'm not sure if it's appropriate in terms of the way that I'm using it, but it does come up, and one way that it has been applied is the diversity of identities that are layered under that term. Deaf plus, queer, deaf plus, neurodiverse, deaf plus, other physical disability, deaf plus having CP, or deaf plus disabled, or deaf plus whatever. All different identities. It's not just about being deaf. This sense of identifying yourself by your hearing capability. It's a much broader range. For me, I identify as a straight white man, right? A cis man. That is my experience. That's the bubble I live in. Not the same as your experience, and it's important for me to be exposed by other experiences in my life, other identities. Also, if you take a look at deaf studies in general, in terms of academics and publications, what is being researched out there, very, very niche area, and very white. So that means that we're learning about deaf culture, and it's very important to learn from the community, and this is where we find the community, the greater community out there.
And that's how I update my content to share with my students when I teach them, and for everyday conversations as well. I point to the people that are really plugged into those communities that I'm not directly connected to. Because all of us are deaf. Right? And then using the term hearing impaired, that's still a no-no, right? But disabled is now accepted. And now the word out there is that deaf people don't want to hear, that don't want to apply to themselves, is stigma. Because stigma also applies of other ways of being. Othered, of being othered, queer, BIPOC, indigenous, neurodivergent, whatever it is. Stigma is outdated. We need to normalize. And that's not how we describe the world. Normal is not how we describe the world. We don't know what that means anymore. Normal is just a term that means bland, that it just gets rubber stamped. It's just a template. And we don't fit in with that. We are all, each of us, unique and different in different ways. What it means to be human, there's no one way to be human. What it means to be gay, there's no one way to be gay. What it means to be autistic, there's no one way to be autistic. What it means to be bald, there's no one way to be bald. I mean, I shake my head. It's not natural. One way to be deaf. No, absolutely not. There's so much diversity in one label, in one community. And so stigma is not used anymore. And I understand that the deaf experience is vast. And we have only started to scratch the surface of unpacking. And so when you read something, or you Google search, oftentimes the things that you find typically are old and outdated. I mean, and that could even be last year outdated, but it's still there. And some of it was foundational to theories, important to understand the history of the deaf experience and how it's changed over time, but does it apply what it means to be deaf today? The best way to find that out is to talk to deaf people themselves. Ask around. Have those conversations, engage. And if you don't follow deaf people on social media, I encourage you to. And comment on their posts, have those interactions. You'll surprise how many of those people will respond. And one thing I feel fortunate with my own privilege is that I travel quite a bit. And so I'm able to meet deaf people all over the country. And I always make the effort to maintain connections with them all over the world, not just here in our country. I connect and maintain those connections because even if I only meet them once in my life, I still consider them that they have enriched my life just by who they are. And for that reason, oftentimes when I travel and meet people and I have conversations, I will take a picture, not just like, hey, I know this person. It's because I want to remember that moment. I want to remember those people. My brain is so full of useless stuff. I'll forget people's faces. I'll forget their names if I don't have those pictures. I've always done that since a child. I rely on pictures. And because my mind is full of useless trivia, a lot about animals. But I want to remember those moments because they're all part of who I am. And my identity includes my traveling, my interactions with deaf people all over. And those connections are part of who I am, my own cultural experience. And I acknowledge that that's a privilege. It means that if somebody doesn't travel or they don't associate other than their community, means they're less than. No, their experience is as valid as mine. In fact, one other thing about the internet, and I forgot to mention this, one thing about social media that's wonderful is that there are communities in the deaf world, and it gives them a way to express themselves that they didn't have as an opportunity before. Everything was just published in hard copy. It wasn't on the internet maybe for all, and before the internet, it wasn't there. Videos and, that are used in conferences and lectures that are created by academic deaf people. that's not full representation of the deaf community. And so their frame of the deaf experience, their cultural experience is different than the entire community. And a lot of social media is user-friendly. Anybody can post, and they do, and they did, which means you're starting to recognize different perspectives, different experiences. They're all populated there. And that allows us to create new signs and to understand the communities in the deaf world better, especially grassroots deaf people. And grassroots deaf people, blue-collar deaf workers who don't have a college education, but still contribute so much in their language, that have been part of the deaf experience. Deaf schools, mainstream, their experiences are valid, but they don't publish papers. They don't travel giving lectures. They don't create educational videos, but their experiences are equal, and social media is really the leveling. And so it becomes that much bigger just overnight with that grassroots movement. And now we see it happening with the deaf-blind community. Now there are more and more on social media. There's more awareness because of the internet. Same thing goes with communities that use Black American Sign Language. It's recognized as its own language now. Right? That means that you don't have to be involved in the academic world to be exposed to all this stuff. It helps, but you don't have to. The internet is there for us, for anyone and everyone, and that's the way it should be. About my privilege. Yeah, so I take pictures of people, and we pose for pictures. And I started this kind of work in my career traveling all over the place. Probably back 20 years ago. And before that, I lived in California after I finished college. I stayed in California for the longest time. I became very involved with community theater there. So hearing community theater, I was very involved. And I had a good friend, I still have many good friends there. We have a Facebook group that I'm still a part of. I'm not on Facebook anymore, but it's there. And it's called I Can't Tonight. I Have Reversal is the name of the group, because that was the case for community theater. And I started taking pictures as I traveled. And there was one person that reached out and said, okay, what the hell are you doing? All I see you do is travel and do like rock pose with other people. And then I tried to explain, oh, I do this, that. And also, I pose with people and say rock on. Because growing up, I had a good education. I was a reader, a voracious reader. I'm a bookworm, I always have been. And I try to learn as much as I can. I love learning more about people. But I think one of the most valuable experiences that I've learned is meeting other deaf people. Different experiences, similar experience, you can't replace that. You can't find that in the classroom, you can't find that on a video. There's no educational video out there that can show you that. There's no book out there that can show you that. And so again, I encourage you to follow deaf people online and be surprised what you might find and how it can benefit you. The future of deaf identity. There are different factors that might affect us. And there is an excellent short film created in England by a British filmmaker called The End. I don't know if any of you have seen it. I see a few hands. It's amazing. And it is a mockumentary. It looks and feels to be a real documentary, but it's just started in the 80s and then goes beyond the present time. So I understand it's not realistic. But deaf people have had that concern that the community, the premise of the film is that a cure for deafness is discovered, right? That it's possible. And they start offering this to deaf people. Some accept it, some don't, and then eventually it gets to the point where they offer it to parents of deaf children before they're old enough to decide for themselves. And so eventually, there are no deaf people left. We become extinct. And that short film is very well made, and it really touches on the concern that deaf people have always had about what's next. and what will endanger our community next. Before, ASL was not looked at, was looked down on, and then hearing technology became a danger. There's always some kind of external force out there. And so far, none of that has worked, but so far. And then genetics. We are now on the cusp of this next thing. With CRISPR gene editing, some people have using that to modify babies before they're even born, which means we might get to the point where we can get rid of some already identified genes that can lead to congenital deafness, right? And we know that there are genes out there, and so these children will not be born deaf. We haven't gotten there yet, where we can necessarily tailor the genetics of our children. And if you watch Star Trek, I'm a Trekkie, you remember there was a war over that, which means it's an ethical gray area. But the point is that the science is there. Stem cell cloning, genetic editing is there. And it might become a factor in the future in terms of the deaf community waning, not completely, but definitely contracting. People are saying, no, it won't be extinct, but there will be less deaf people if that happens. This is possible. The legislation, we see some interesting changes happening nationwide that might impact the deaf experience. Not the number of deaf people, but the experience in education, the experience in the business world, the experience in communication access, and our rights might be different than things are today. And then our identity will be different because the cultural experience is different. But one thing I ponder, and it's not just me, but I suspect if I were to share this, if the rights to interpreting access diminishes, will deaf schools then grow again? I don't know. If deaf children can't get language access in their mainstream settings, maybe deaf schools will become the solution. Is that a bad thing? It'll be different. It means the deaf experience will change once again. Deaf schools have been around for a long time, and Gallaudet University often sees them as the really foundation for ASL and its proliferation. And also the cultural experience happens at deaf schools in Gallaudet. And so if they become stronger again because mainstreaming isn't the option, that it's less legally feasible, that might be interesting, but it's a possibility. And if not deaf schools and not mainstreaming settings, then deaf people will have a different experience altogether. Positive, negative, different. The cultural experiences could be different. And we will know, because we have the internet and social media, we will know, it will be visible. And again, this is up in the air. It's just a possibility. We don't know. But those factors are something to consider, the unknown. Wheel of Fortune. I'm not talking about the game show. It's an old theory. Remember, I majored in creative writing. I'm an English major. I love literature. And I teach Shakespeare currently. So we talk about this. It's the concept of fortune and positive or negative life experiences. Not luck, but what happens to you during life. And it usually is like a wheel. It goes up and down. It's cyclical. And deaf people throughout history have had their ups and their downs, their highs and lows, throughout whatever. There have been documentation of deaf communities that are very strong in the past. You might not think it was possible with the lack of awareness and the lack of communication access, but they were very vibrant deaf communities. They stuck together and they supported each other. Over in France, 500 years ago. And then in Ecuador, right now, the deaf community is very strong, close-knit. They advocate for themselves. They advance in getting their rights and recognition, things that we take for granted. Other communities are now in the process of achieving. So I don't mean deaf people all around the world at the same time have their ups and downs. It happens at different points in time. Sometimes we have our lows, our frustrations. Moralism became entrenched during a time where listening technology hadn't emerged yet. deaf people being forced to speak and listen, and being frustrated, or laws being passed that aren't around anymore, but made oralism, that curriculum, the only possible thing in the state. Nebraska, for example. Nothing against people in Nebraska, but that law was passed a ways back, and it was challenged and got rid of. But those are the highs and lows. I mean, who knows what the next high will be? Who knows what the next low will be? We can't predict that. The world is always changing. Maybe we'll have a new pandemic where everybody becomes deaf. Who knows? It could be a different cultural experience for all of us. Somebody hopes so over there.
That's actually the premise of a book. It was written by John Eckhart, a deaf person. It's called Minefield. And it's about a minefield that impacts the world, and the pandemic spreads, and everybody becomes deaf as a result. So I'm not the first person to think of that, is my point, but what are the factors in the future that will determine the impact of the deaf experience and the deaf cultural identity? And again, it might not be an overnight change. It's going to be slow and steady. We've talked about the pros and cons of stem cell cloning, gosh, since the year 2000, 2001, something like that. Remember when Dolly the sheep was cloned? That's been a couple of years since, right? Thank you. Yes, somebody remembers that. So the potential is there, and how it impacts us. Could impact people's hearing parts, right? It could grow new nerves. Things like that could be used. So what's really important is to look again at that cultural identity, not just what you can see in a publication or a presentation, but the living, breathing experience, the living mechanism in the universe. Okay? All right. Now I'm going to open up for questions. I mean, I know, sometimes I don't know, but I'll do my best to answer your questions. If anybody wants to get up and use sign language to ask your questions, that's fine. We have interpreters if you want to use your voice. And we will be copy signing so everybody can follow.
If anybody has a question, please come up to the front of the stage.
If you're stage shy, I apologize, but if you could come up to the front. Awesome presentation. We talked a lot about, well, a couple things I want to talk about. A lot about deaf identities, and I was talking with people that were seated near me about that, and also felt like you signed neurodivergent are starting to develop their own identity as well. And are people like you studying the question of identity with all disabilities? And then the second one, with all those groups. And then do you notice some of the old gatekeeping going away and then new ones popping up? Thank you for the question. So you asked me two questions. The first, am I studying neurodivergence? Personally, no. But I know that a lot of my students have those identities of neurodivergent, and I'm meeting more and more interpreters in the field who also will share that they are neurodivergent or have autism. So it's our understanding of what that means in general is changing as neurodivergent as people are disclosing and sharing from interpreters and also deaf people as well. So very interesting to see interpreters and interpreting students sharing and really enjoying the use of sign language. That seems to be a good fit for them for whatever reasons, for their neurodivergent reasons. But yes, it should be studied. If it isn't being studied, it needs to be. And I have two students right now who both are excellent students, outstanding ASL students, and they're both saying that if it wasn't for ASL, they feel that they wouldn't have been able to really survive their lives. Because as they stepped out off campus, there was nobody to really have social experiences with at home. and they had to continue to adjust themselves to fit into society and struggle to find their place. I think as a society, we are shifting our understanding of neurodivergence, and we are more acceptance of it. The stigma is lessened and the like for all of those reasons. Now, the studies about deaf people and their experiences, those are valid questions, and scientists need to study those, and I'd be more than happy to do that. I can certainly bring that back, but it's something that needs to be studied and looked closer at. I completely agree. Very valid. Worth doing. Your second question about gatekeeping. There will always be gatekeepers somewhere. And I think it comes from change itself. So when we are in a gatekeeping world and we experience change, and there's more pressure maybe to use sign language or less of it, those gatekeepers out in the deaf world, for example, will see this change happening. For example, new laws passing that are creating barriers and impacting gatekeepers about, for example, ASL becoming recognized as an official language and the rights within. So that always comes from who is responsible, who maintains it, and that can change over time. Other questions? There's some people coming forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I really learned a lot. My name is Mary, and I'm in ASL 1. Yes, and I really enjoy learning about ASL culture and community, but I was really wondering, how can I find credible sources to learn more about the culture and how I can support the community?
For me, the most credible source is the community itself. That's why I really encourage you to find deaf people on social media, because that is where it's at right now. Yes, there are some videos out there, there's some articles out there that you can use, but right now, follow people online. They are out there, they're open-minded to many points of view, including the deaf point of view. If you don't have the opportunity to really travel and physically meet people, at least you can see them online. And again, one negative is that there are 80% of all the signed content is in ASL. 80%. So that means that to get a sense of other cultural experiences is lessened from around the world, but it's primarily an American perspective. Thank you for that.
So, name dropping all the internet people, I can give you some names, that's fine. Yeah, come on up.
Hi, I go here at Penn, and I'm taking ASL 2 currently in my second semester. And I was writing a paper for ASL, and I was explaining to my friend that I was writing about deaf culture. And I was having a hard time giving him a baseline definition of it. So could you provide that for me? What can I go back and say to him?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, if you want something foundational, just to say first, there is a culture, we do have that, but there are 5 hallmarks that you can check that designate that it's a cultural group. You have to have your own language, which we do, your own traditions, we do. We have our own cultural leaders, people we look up to, their contributions to our history. We have cultural leaders, Calvin University, Laurent Claire, George Vagans, right? We have those people. And then there are a couple more. Give me a minute. Right? Our value system as well. We do have that. Our shared values. And lastly, our arts. Storytelling, the via movement. If you check all those hallmarks, then you have a culture. Those are the foundations of culture. thank you for coming. I'm wondering, your experience with theatrical interpreting. You work with hearing interpreters. Has it been a good experience, or, and then hearing interpreters? You see them in different places. How do they change? What is that like? Does that capture?
I have been working as a theater interpreter for a long time, and I got involved because I just decided I want to do it. I wanted to do it. So I was assertive. I knew there were theaters in my area. I knew that shows were interpreted, and I knew that the fee was that I would have to get a shirt. I needed to get a certain shirt, so that was the price I had to pay for that. And my time, of course, as well. Not the skill, but the time. So yes, I do work with hearing interpreters very often. I have not experienced work with other deaf peers, but I have worked with a DAZO and a theater interpreter. I believe that I will soon be working with another deaf interpreter soon, coming up very soon, working in a deaf team. But working in hearing teams, really, it's like any other interpreting experience, very similar. We work collaboratively as a team. I don't really have a lot of negative experiences in that area, but I'm a stubborn person. So I'm very assertive, and I do get what I want. What I think needs to happen will happen. We will talk about analyzing different perspectives, and sometimes I just think the other person's wrong, and that's what I think about it. So I've seen a lot of interpreted theater out there. Some of it is excellent, and some of it is not so great. And most of it lies somewhere in the middle. So it really can depend on a lot of factors about prep time, the interpreters being willing to really do the work that's required to interpret a piece of theater, and experience, having the background. You said something about, localities or local interpreters?
Different places where you encounter hearing interpreters.
Can you help me understand what you mean by that?
Like if you see cultural appropriation with hearing interpreters.
I see, we're talking about cultural appropriation with hearing interpreters. Theater interpreters specifically?
Yes.
Let me think. It's hard to identify for a couple of reasons. First of all, those interpreters who are a good fit for telling stories and talking about history, it's hard to find them. It's difficult to find those interpreters. Sometimes you have to work with what you have, but they might not necessarily be a good fit to that type of work. Sometimes somebody steps forward and says, I'll do the work. I got this, I'm an expert, but they might or might not be a good fit to that show. So it really depends on who you have in your local area, who might be the better fit, who has the background and knowledge to be the right interpreter for that story. But yes, those things can happen. I see somebody else has a comment. Yeah, somebody's talking about a particular situation with Keith Wan. I'm sure you saw that news story a couple of years ago. It's got a lot of traction. They had hired him to interpret Lion King on Broadway in New York City. And then, what was it, the production company or the theater, the agency, somebody in that world reached out to Keith and said, you know what, I think they prefer to have a BIPOC interpreter for this story. Keith was upset and didn't necessarily support that, although I did, so he made that decision. I supported it because the setting was in Africa, and Keith Wan, that is not his background. So I will share with you as well. I just saw a play last week, A Raisin in the Sun. A fantastic cast, a beautiful show, and the two interpreters were both Black. They did a wonderful job. I enjoyed the show tremendously. They were excellent. A beautiful facilitator of the language, but for me, I have interpreted that show, I have to tell you, as a white person 15, 16 years ago. I didn't want to, but there was nobody out there. The offer came to me, and so I pushed back. I checked with the cast to ask if they were comfortable, because I had friends in the cast. I got their approval, but looking back, I I don't think I did the show justice. I know that I didn't do it justice because I couldn't. It was physically impossible for me to. I recognize that. Even though I was willing to provide the access, I just could have stepped away, but I should have stepped away looking back at it. So yes, we do see some interpreters who aren't necessarily the best fit, but again, it's a tough position to be in. It's between a rock and a hard place. If they don't do the work, there's no access, but if they do, sometimes it's not the right representation. So what I would support is that the theaters who have the money, who have the funding, hire whoever they can from anywhere, and not only to pull from the local pool. That's worth doing.
You have a deaf person who identifies and a person that doesn't identify correctly as disabled. Thank you. How does that work with the deaf community?
Let me rephrase. Let me just rephrase your question to make sure that I understand you correctly. You're asking deaf people who identify as disabled, some, and others who do not. Does that cause some type of friction or some disconnect? How does it affect the greater community? Thank you. That's kind of what I'm emphasizing here tonight, is that deafness is on the spectrum. It's a whole spectrum, and we have to accept and acknowledge the entire range. We have to give the community as much power as we can in our advocacy and in our understanding of self, to make sure that we understand each other and we make those personal connections, that there should not be any gatekeeping because it never serves the community well. And the way that that impacts our community right now is that we have people who do identify as disabled and some who don't. And that's part of the collective, and we're not all cohesive quite yet. We're on different sides of that fence. Next question.
I'm going to try my best to express this clearly. A lot of ideas right now. But back to your comment about gatekeeping, once again. And maybe it's not important right now, but in the past, it was a we're capital D deaf, culturally deaf, or part of the deaf community. And you talked about that shared experience. And then that gatekeeping. How much of that shared experience do you think relates to trauma as it regards spoken language? That's what I'd like to ask.
Yes, thank you for that question. That is a good term, not a great concept. Trauma is not a great concept, but it's a great way to identify this idea. That the whole concept of ASL being the priority, sign language being important for deaf people, and trying to reject oralism, that is a traumatic identity building experience. And for people in other communities, they experience other traumas. That's a part of our shared history. So there's the choice to maintain that trauma and to share that trauma with future generations, or let it go. And we see different things. They're all valid experiences. We see the gamut. We have some deaf people who have been through a lot of personal trauma in a variety of ways. As a collective, they have collective trauma, and then there are other traumas that we have individually. And these things are evolving, of course, as part of our experience, our shared values, our shared beliefs, our shared background experiences. Yes, those are all still there, but that capital D deaf, it definitely comes from there. So I think, again, that is why it's important to recognize today people being more open-minded about sharing those traumas, so that we can better understand each other, look deeper at where these identities come from and engage in a more deliberative way, be able to move past them, or be able to fight back, whatever is necessary. Trauma itself can be a catalyst for change, and it has been a catalyst for change, so it's important to acknowledge it. Thank you.
We have time for 2 more questions. Hello. I'm really thinking. There's a lot to process. You were talking about identifying as disabled. And my students, I teach at another university, and we say it's a double-edged sword. Because, as you mentioned, I mean, obviously, I'm not disabled, I'm able-bodied, look at me, right? I'm just like all hearing people. I have all these things that I can do. But then you say, you're not disabled, but you have to be careful because there are laws, right? And the law is outlined in Section 504, the ADA, IDEA, all these different laws we have on the books. So they say, oh, you're deaf, but you're not disabled. Oh, let's see here. Okay, well, these different provisions in the laws don't really apply to you. And the deaf person says, no, I need those things. And they say, but what you just said you're not disabled. What gives? Right? So that's a cautionary thing, that it's a double-edged sword, and I tell that to my students at the university that I teach in. And so, how do we necessarily define people? Because it's great that there's awareness, but then outside of this room, how do we make that happen? And then secondly, we look at the word deaf. And there's culturally deaf and then lowercase d deaf, right? And in the past, how you would define culturally deaf was very easy. You went to a school for the deaf, you came from a deaf family, those kinds of things. And now, how we look at it has changed. And so how do we define it? From culturally deaf to not? Is there some point halfway? Is that where we meet? Medium D deaf? And so I'm just thinking, how do we define that? And then those that haven't gone to school for the deaf, that don't come from a deaf family, that are kind of on the opposite, that really are culturally deaf, but that aren't culturally deaf formally, but then how do we view them? And how do they identify themselves? It's something to look at. And to me, things are in flux. They are changing. And again, how much knowledge and awareness is out there? Deaf clubs, for example. Many of them have closed, unfortunately, right? And that was one part of the gatekeeping. I don't know if it was exactly gatekeeping, I don't know how to put it best. And from the audience saying, yes, it was gatekeeping. Okay, so I'll support that. And so welcoming people and exposing them, those that have been mainstream, those who just don't know what it's like to be in the deaf world. And they go to a deaf club and they say, oh, that's what it's like. So with the deaf clubs closing, how does that happen? How do we replace that? There's got to be something. I mean, you gave a great talk. I really enjoyed it, and it got me thinking. And so, good job.
Thank you, Charles Malone. Thank you. Yes, thank you for sharing all of that. I think ultimately, I don't have a quick and easy answer for you. Ultimately, we need to keep this question going. We need to keep having this conversation. How do we define disability? How do we actually define culturally deaf? What does capital D really mean? We need to continue to challenge ourselves, those old assumptions, challenge those definitions because they don't apply anymore. Just like Charles was saying, most of us have felt like I'm not disabled, but then if they're not disabled, they run into other problems because society itself can be disabling. So neither of us is right or wrong. Both experiences are equally valid. We just need to continue to have this conversation as a collective to share all of our ideas as one community and how can we describe that lived experience. Not just one way. We have to continue to talk about it because the information is not out there. We need to develop it for all of ourselves. So I say keep the connections going, keep being engaged with the community, keep having this conversation. That's what's really important because the answer is to keep asking the question. That's what's important. Thank you. Yes?
Hi, I just wanted to say, great presentation, I really enjoyed it. But before you mentioned artistic signing, and specifically that you were doing work with Shakespearean translations in ASL, And I was just wondering if there were any specific challenges you might have faced while trying to maintain some of those elements of Old English while also making it more easily understood by the deaf community.
Well, that's a whole other presentation right there. We can talk about translations of Shakespeare. And I use Shakespeare because that's the common sign that's been used for Shakespeare, but actually I don't necessarily usually sign that anymore. I think it's a stupid sign name anyway, like Shakespeare. Give me a break. But I sign this for Shakespeare. But anyway, point being, the translations of Shakespeare, there are two ways to go about it. One has been around for quite some time. Theater interpreters, ASL performers will use sign language for Shakespeare, and that will match the production. If it's Macbeth, and if it's a punk club, then they have the captions to match that, right? It will reflect that. If it's an all women and non-binary cast for Hamlet, then we'll have the language to match that. That's theatrical interpreting, you match the show. But I'm currently working on a project, which is my own personal project, and that's translating all 28 plays for academic purposes, so people can then read the plays with their eyes. I'm not trying to personify different characters, I'm just doing the translations. And I'm telling you, it's a real motherfucker. And I am trying to be really reflective of the language and how Shakespeare wrote it. At the same time, ASL didn't exist until 280 years ago, so to speak. So trying to figure that out, how to find that balance is a different animal, but I can tell you how I do it, and it's all research. Talking with colleagues, analyzing the text, and it doesn't happen quickly.
Looks like it's time to wrap up. We want to thank Crom so much. Thank you.
Thank you, interpreters.
Thank you all. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for hanging through the rain and making it out here. Appreciate it.